One, the silence that stayed. There are silences that feel peaceful. And then there are silences that stay. Not for a minute. Not for an awkward pause you laugh off. But the kind that moves in, quietly. And starts living between two people. You can hear it in the smallest things. In the way a "how was your day" turns into fine. In the way a smile becomes a habit. In the way your phone lights up. And your chest still doesn't. Because nothing is wrong. And that's what makes it so confusing. No shouting. No slammed doors. No dramatic goodbye. Just absence. Wearing the shape of someone who's right beside you. You sit on the same couch. You share the same bed. You brush past each other in the hallway like strangers who once memorized each other's faces. And you start doing this thing. This quiet, desperate math. If I'm patient enough. If I'm softer. If I stop needing so much. Maybe they'll come back to me. But here's the silent truth. The one nobody teaches you to say out loud. Sometimes, the person doesn't leave. They just stop arriving. And it hurts in a special way. Because you can't point to the moment it happened. There's no single betrayal to blame. No clear villain. Just you. Trying to feel loved. Inside a room that keeps getting colder. So if you've ever sat in a relationship and felt lonelier than you did when you were single, I want you to stay with me. Because this story isn't about being too sensitive. It's about being awake enough to notice when love becomes a quiet, empty place. Before we go further, if these words are landing somewhere deep in you, please subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast. We tell the stories people don't know how to confess. And we make space for the feelings you've been carrying alone. Alright? Take a breath. Let your shoulders drop. And in the next part, we're going to name what this really is. And why it can feel like abandonment. Even when nobody walks away. 2. When presence feels empty. He was still there. That was the strangest part. His keys still hit the counter. His jacket still hung in the same place. His body still warmed the other side of the bed. But his presence didn't. It's a particular kind of loneliness. The kind that happens while someone is looking right at you. You can be talking and feel them drifting, inch by inch, behind their eyes. Not angry, not cruel. Just unreachable. And you start noticing the pattern. They answer questions. But never the ones that matter. They ask about your day. But only long enough to be polite. They touch your shoulder in passing. Like checking a box. Like a reminder, I'm here. When what you're starving for is, I'm with you. So you do what people do when they're afraid to lose someone, you become easier. You keep your voice soft. You cut your feelings into smaller pieces. You learn how to say, it's fine. In a way that doesn't sound like a request. You stop bringing up the things that make you tremble. You stop asking, can we talk? Because you already know how it ends. A sigh. A glance at the clock. A sentence that sounds reasonable and still feels like rejection. Not tonight. Can we not do this? I'm tired. I just don't have the energy. And maybe he truly didn't. But the damage isn't only in what he couldn't give. It's in what you slowly teach yourself to stop needing. You start grieving, quietly, for basic things. Eye contact that stays. A conversation that doesn't escape. A hug that holds for 3 seconds longer. Just long enough to say, I'm not going anywhere. Instead, you get the version of love that feels like a hallway light. It's on. But it doesn't warm the room. So you sit beside him. And your mind does something brutal. You remember how he used to laugh. The kind that shook his shoulders. You remember how he used to ask questions, like he was hungry to know you. And now, you're speaking to a calm face, listening to a calm voice, and feeling your own heart shout in a soundproof space. That's the moment Evelyn realized. You can be chosen and still feel abandoned, not by distance, not by disappearance, but by the slow, quiet erosion of emotional presence, until all that's left is two people sharing air and calling it a relationship. Free redefining abandonment. Most people think abandonment looks like a suitcase by the door, a slammed car door, a name you stop seeing on your phone. But sometimes abandonment is quieter than that. Sometimes it's a hand you can still hold, that never really holds you back. It's the way someone stays in the room, but exits every conversation the moment it turns emotional. It's the way they say, "I'm here," and you can feel the distance in the syllables. Because abandonment isn't only about someone leaving, it can be about someone withdrawing. Not in one dramatic moment, but in tiny, invisible steps. First, they stop asking follow-up questions. Then they stop noticing your mood. Then they stop offering comfort, unless you ask for it twice. And even then, it comes out stiff, like a borrowed language, like they're performing care instead of feeling it. So you tell yourself it doesn't count. You say, "At least he didn't cheat. At least he didn't hit me. At least he comes home. At least he pays the bills. At least he's not gone." And that word, "at least," becomes a cage, because you start comparing your pain to worse pain, until you no longer trust your own heart. But your nervous system knows. It knows when love feels unsafe. Not because of violence, but because of unpredictability. Because you never know which version of them you'll get. The warm one, or the blank one. The reachable one, or the distant one. And your body adjusts. You scan for tone. You read micro-expressions. You learn to measure silence like weather, to predict storms that never fully arrive, but keep you braced all the same. That's when Evelyn realized something that shocked her. She wasn't overreacting. She was responding to emotional absence. A form of abandonment that doesn't look like abandonment, because it happens while the relationship is still intact. It's grief without permission. Loss without a funeral. A goodbye that never gets spoken. And the hardest part? When you try to explain it, people look confused. They say, "But he's there, right?" They say, "So what's the problem?" They say, "Maybe you're asking for too much." But asking for presence isn't asking for too much. Asking to be met isn't being needy. It's being human. And redefining abandonment begins right here. Not with the moment someone walks away, but with the moment you realize you've been alone while holding someone's hand, for loving someone who isn't there. There is a specific kind of heartbreak that comes from loving someone who is physically present, but emotionally unreachable. It doesn't explode. It doesn't scream. It erodes. Slowly, quietly, day by day. You love them in ways they never quite notice. You remember what matters to them. You soften your edges. You adjust your timing, your tone, your needs. And still, it feels like talking to someone standing behind glass. You can see them. You can hear them. But you can't reach them. You start blaming yourself in subtle ways. Maybe I'm not saying it right. Maybe I'm asking at the wrong time. Maybe if I explain it better, or ask less, or smile more, maybe then they'll finally turn toward me. But love shouldn't feel like a performance review. And connection shouldn't require strategy. Yet here you are, rehearsing conversations in your head. editing your feelings before they leave your mouth, watering yourself down so you don't overwhelm someone who never learned how to hold emotion. You begin to miss them, even while they're sitting next to you. You miss the version of them who used to look at you like you mattered. You miss the warmth, the curiosity, the sense that your inner world was welcome here. Now, when you speak, they nod. When you pause, they don't lean in. When you hurt, they offer solutions instead of presence. And that's when it hits you. You're not lonely because you're alone. You're lonely because the person you love is unavailable in the one place you need them most. So you keep loving. You love quietly. You love carefully. You love without expectation. Until one day you realize you've been loving someone who hasn't truly met you in a long time. And that kind of love hurts in a way that's hard to explain. Because no one abandoned you loudly. No one slammed a door. They just never fully showed up. And you stayed, hoping that loving harder might somehow make them arrive. 5. The first quiet adaptation. The first change doesn't feel like a loss. It feels reasonable. You tell yourself you're just being patient, just being understanding, just being mature. So you adjust. Not all at once, but gently, almost lovingly. You stop bringing things up the moment you feel them. You wait. You let the feeling pass. You tell yourself it wasn't important anyway. You start choosing peace over honesty, silence over explanation, smiling over asking. Not because you're weak, but because you've learned what happens when you ask for more. The sigh, the tension, the way the room changes temperature. So you adapt. You lower your voice before it even rises. You soften your words before they can sound like needs. You rehearse sentences in your head and delete half of them before they ever leave your mouth. You become efficient with your feelings. Careful. Minimal. You learn which topics drain him and quietly remove them from your life. You learn which emotions make him retreat and you carry them alone instead. This is the first quiet adaptation. The moment you stop asking, not because you don't need, but because you don't want to be a burden. And it works. At least on the surface. There are fewer arguments, less friction, more calm. People might even say, "You two seem good." But inside, something begins to thin. You notice it late at night, when you replay conversations and realize how little of yourself was actually there. You notice it when something wonderful happens, and you hesitate before sharing it, unsure whether it will be met with warmth or indifference. You notice it when something hurts, and your first instinct is to handle it alone. That's when you realize you didn't stop feeling. You just stopped expressing. You didn't become independent. You became invisible. And the most dangerous part? No one asked you to do this. No rule was spoken. No boundary was set. You adapted because love felt conditional, because presence felt fragile, because you sensed that needing less made you easier to keep. So you made yourself smaller without ever meaning to. And somewhere in that quiet adjustment, you crossed a line from being a partner to managing yourself, so someone else wouldn't have to. 6. Becoming low maintenance. It doesn't happen all at once. You don't wake up one day and decide to need less. You learn it. You learn which emotions make him uncomfortable. You learn which questions create distance. You learn which parts of yourself are easier for him to tolerate when they stay quiet. So you begin editing, not the relationship, but yourself. You stop asking for reassurance. You stop reaching out when you're tired. You stop saying, "I miss you," because you don't want to sound like pressure. You tell yourself you're being low maintenance. Easy to love. Easy to be with. You take pride in it. You say things like, "I'm fine on my own. I don't need much. I don't want to be needy." And part of you believes it. But another part of you feels strangely hollow. Because being low maintenance was never who you were. It's who you became to survive loving someone who couldn't meet you emotionally. You start carrying your sadness silently, processing joy alone, celebrating wins in your head instead of out loud. You become very good at not asking, and people praise you for it. They say you're independent, strong, so easygoing. They don't see the cost. They don't see how often you swallow words, how often you rehearse texts and delete them, how often you talk yourself out of wanting closeness, because needing less feels safer than being disappointed again. But something subtle shifts inside you. Your laugh gets quieter. Your excitement becomes cautious. Your needs feel embarrassing. And one day you realize you've been shrinking to fit into the emotional space someone else was willing to offer. Not because you wanted to, but because you thought this was the price of staying. And that's the cruelest part. You didn't ask for too much. You just asked the wrong person to meet you where you were. Becoming low maintenance wasn't growth. It was grief, trying to make itself acceptable. 7. When silence becomes survival. At first, silence feels like kindness, like giving someone space, like choosing peace. But slowly, it changes. Silence stops being a choice and becomes a reflex. You don't even notice the moment it happens. You just start swallowing things automatically. A disappointment, a worry, a sentence that begins with, "I need." You taste it on your tongue and pull it back, because you've learned something your body never forgets. When you speak, he pulls away. When you cry, he goes quiet. When you ask for closeness, he gets tired. So you adapt the only way your nervous system knows how. You go still. You learn to read the room like a warning sign. You learn to hear his mood in the way he closes a drawer, in the weight of his footsteps, in the space between his words. And you build your whole emotional life around not triggering distance. You become an expert in timing, in tone, in restraint. You save your feelings for later, but later never comes. Because later he's distracted. Later he's stressed. Later he's asleep. Later becomes a graveyard of conversations that never get to exist. And silence becomes survival. Not because you don't have anything to say, but because saying it feels dangerous. Not dangerous like violence. Dangerous like losing what little connection you still have. So you keep the peace. You keep the routine. You keep the relationship functioning. And you pay for it with yourself. You start feeling like your emotions are inconvenient. Like your needs are messy. Like your sadness is something to clean up quickly, so it doesn't burden anyone. You laugh when you want to scream. You change the subject when your chest tightens. You say, "It's nothing," when it's everything. And here's the part nobody warns you about. When you silence yourself long enough, you start to disappear. Not from the relationship, from your own life. Your opinions get softer. Your wants get smaller. Your dreams get postponed. Your voice becomes background noise. Even to you. Evelyn didn't realize she was doing it. Until one night she caught herself mid-thought. I should tell him, I'm not okay. And then the next thought came. Quiet, immediate, practiced. But it's not worth it. That's when she understood. Silence wasn't making things better. Silence was keeping her safe from rejection. Silence was the armor she built. Because love had become unpredictable. And once silence is survival, you're no longer living in love. You're living in avoidance. 8. The cost of staying. Staying doesn't always look like loyalty. Sometimes it looks like slow self-erasure. Because when you stay with someone who won't meet you emotionally, you don't just lose moments. You lose permission. Permission to feel. Permission to ask. Permission to be fully human in front of the person you love. At first, you tell yourself you're strong. That you can handle it. That love is supposed to be patient. So you tolerate the emptiness. You normalize it. You make excuses for it. Until your standards become so quiet, you can barely hear them. And the cost begins to show up in places you don't expect. It shows up in your sleep. How you wake up tired, even after 8 hours. In your body. How your chest tightens when you hear his car pull in. Not from joy, but from uncertainty. It shows up in your mind. How you replay conversations, searching for what you did wrong, when the truth is, you were just asking to be seen. It shows up in your personality. You stop being playful. Because play requires safety. You stop being spontaneous. Because spontaneity requires trust. You start walking on emotional tiptoes. Measuring every word, every sigh, every pause, like you're negotiating a fragile peace treaty. And then there's the worst cost of all. You begin to distrust yourself. You second-guess your feelings. You minimize your needs. You gaslight your own loneliness. You say, it's not that bad. You say, other people have it worse. You say, maybe I'm just dramatic. But your heart keeps sending the same message. Over and over. I am not being held. And the longer you stay, the more you start living in almost. Almost loved. Almost understood. Almost chosen. Almost. You don't leave? Because there's no clear moment to point to. No single betrayal. No one huge disaster. Just 1,000 tiny abandonments. That don't look like abandonment. A conversation that ends too soon. A hug that doesn't return. A look that slides past you. A later that never comes. And at some point, Evelyn realized something terrifying. Staying was costing her more than leaving ever would. Because leaving would break her heart once. But staying was breaking it quietly. Every day. 9. Grieving while still together. There's a kind of grief that doesn't get recognized. Because nothing ended. No breakup text. No final argument. No empty apartment. Just two people still together. And one of them quietly mourning. You don't grieve a person who left. You grieve the person who stopped showing up. You grieve the version of him who used to look at you like you were the best part of his day. You grieve the softness in his voice. The way he once reached for you first. The way he used to notice small things, like the tiredness in your eyes, the tremble in your laugh. Now, you can be falling apart. And he'll ask if you want tea. Not because he's cruel, but because he doesn't know what to do with real emotion. So you start grieving in secret. In the bathroom, with the faucet running. In the car, before you pull into the driveway. In the laundry room, folding shirts that still smell like him. While you wonder where he went inside himself. You grieve the conversations you never got to have. the apologies you'll never hear, the comfort you keep needing and keep not receiving. And the strangest part? You feel guilty for grieving, because he's still right there. He still kisses your forehead, still texts, "On my way," still says, "Love you," in a voice that sounds automatic. So you tell yourself, maybe this is just adulthood. Maybe love is supposed to get quiet. Maybe I'm asking for a fantasy. But your body refuses to call this normal, because your nervous system knows the difference between quiet peace and quiet abandonment. Peace feels soft. Peace feels warm. Peace feels safe. This feels like holding your breath in your own home. And that is grief. Grief for the intimacy you lost, while the relationship stayed intact. Grief for the warmth that used to live here. Grief for the way you used to be, when you believed you were held. Evelyn realized she was grieving when she caught herself wishing for something to happen. Not something tragic, just something clear. A fight. A confession. A moment where he finally says, "I can't do this emotionally." Because clarity, even painful clarity, would be kinder than this endless limbo. But limbo has a price. You start living halfway, half hopeful, half numb. You keep showing up, and slowly stop expecting. And that's what it means to grieve while still together. To mourn a love that's fading, without ever being allowed to call it a loss. 10. Naming the unspoken truth. There comes a moment, quiet, almost ordinary, when you stop asking, "What's wrong with us?" and start asking, "What's happening to me?" Because the grief gets heavier. Not louder. Heavier. It sits in your chest like wet fabric. It follows you into grocery aisles, into meetings, into the shower, and you realize you've been living with a feeling you don't have words for. So you give it a name. Not stress. Not a rough patch. Not "we're just busy." You name it honestly. Emotional abandonment. Not because he left, but because he stopped meeting you. Not because he was cruel, but because he was unavailable. In the one way that makes love feel real. And naming it changes everything. Because once you call it what it is, you can't keep pretending it's nothing. Evelyn tried. At first, she said, "Maybe I'm too sensitive." She said, "Maybe I'm asking for too much." She said, "Maybe this is just what long-term love becomes." But the truth kept returning. Soft. Relentless. If you feel alone all the time, you're alone. And she started noticing how often she translated him. He would say, "I'm fine." And she would hear, "Please don't ask me for depth." He would say, "Can we not do this?" And she would hear, "Your feelings cost me energy." He would say, "I'm tired." And she would hear, "I don't have space for you." Not because he meant to hurt her, but because this was the language he had. And yet, impact is still impact. So she stopped using the softer words that let the pain hide. She stopped calling it distance. She stopped calling it a phase. She called it what it felt like: being emotionally alone, while still attached to someone. And that's the unspoken truth most people fear to say. You can love someone deeply and still be neglected. You can share a home and still be unseen. You can be faithful and still be abandoned. Because abandonment isn't only absence of a person, it's absence of care, absence of curiosity, absence of tenderness, absence of emotional safety. And once you name that truth, you begin to see the pattern behind it. How often you shrink. How often you apologize for needing. How often you settle for crumbs. and call it a meal. Naming the truth doesn't mean you hate him. It doesn't mean you're giving up. It means you're finally choosing reality over hope that keeps wounding you. Because clarity is not cruel. Clarity is mercy. And the moment you name the unspoken truth is the moment your healing quietly begins. 11. Letting go of self-blame. Self-blame is the last thing you hold onto when you're afraid the truth will cost you everything. Because if it's your fault, then you can fix it. You can work harder, love better, be softer, be quieter, be easier. So you start editing your humanity like it's a problem. You replay every conversation like courtroom footage. You examine your tone, your timing, your facial expression. You wonder if you asked in the wrong way, if you needed too much, if your sadness was unattractive, if your emotions were too heavy to carry. And the cruel part is, you can always find evidence. One moment you raised your voice. One time you cried too long. One night you said, I can't do this anymore. So you convince yourself that you created the distance. But Evelyn began to see something else. She began to see how often she was willing. How often she tried to reconnect. How often she bent herself into gentler shapes, just to keep love from breaking. And she asked a different question. What if my needs aren't the problem? What if they're simply unmet? That question changes the air in the room. Because a need isn't a flaw. A need is information. I need to feel safe. I need to be heard. I need warmth. I need someone to stay with me when I'm not okay. Those aren't demands. They're basic human requirements. And then came the hardest truth. You can be loving and still not be loved back in the way you deserve. You can be loyal and still be emotionally neglected. It doesn't mean you failed. It doesn't mean you're too much. It means you're trying to drink water from a well that isn't filled. So Evelyn stopped apologizing for her heart. She stopped translating loneliness into mood. She stopped calling grief overthinking. She started saying, quietly, to herself first, I am not wrong for wanting closeness. I am not difficult for needing reassurance. I am not broken because I feel this. And the self-blame began to loosen. Not all at once, but like a tight knot, slowly giving way. Because she realized the reason she blamed herself was because it was safer than accepting the possibility that he simply couldn't meet her. But safety built on illusion is still a cage. Letting go of self-blame isn't about making him the villain. It's about finally making space for the truth. Some people love you to the edge of their capacity. And if their capacity is small, you will keep feeling like you're too much. When you're not, you're just in the wrong container. And when you understand that, your chest softens, your breath returns, because you stop fighting yourself and begin, at last, to stand on your own side. 12. Allowing the grief. Grief is not always loud. Sometimes it's polite. It waits until the dishes are done, until the lights are off, until you're alone in the car, hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing, because you've been trained by life, by love, by survival, to keep it together, to be fine, to be functional, to be easy to live with. So the grief becomes quiet. It slips into your body instead of your voice. A tight throat, a heavy chest, a stomach that won't settle. And you tell yourself, I'm okay. But your body doesn't believe you. Evelyn didn't let herself grieve for a long time, because grief felt like proof. Proof that she had lost something. Proof that her hope was dying. Proof that the love she wanted might not be coming back. So she kept it contained, like holding water in her hands. But grief doesn't disappear. It just finds new places to leak. It shows up as numbness, as irritability, as exhaustion that sleep can't fix. It shows up in the way you stare at your phone and don't want to reply to anyone. It shows up in the way you stop playing music, stop laughing loudly, stop making plans, because part of you is busy mourning, even if you never said the word. And then, one night, Evelyn stopped fighting it. She didn't analyze. She didn't justify. She didn't try to be strong. She just let the grief arrive. A slow inhale, and then the kind of exhale that breaks you open. Tears that didn't need a story. Tears that weren't asking for permission. Tears that finally admitted, "This hurts. I miss what we had. I miss what we could have been. I'm tired of carrying this alone." And something strange happened. The more she allowed the grief, the less it controlled her. Because feelings don't want to destroy you. They want to move through you. Grief is not weakness. Grief is a form of honesty. It says, "This mattered. This was real. This left a mark." And allowing the grief doesn't mean you're giving up. It means you're stopping the war inside your own chest. It means you're letting your heart speak in the only language it has left. So Evelyn gave herself permission, not to be okay, but to be true, to sit with the loss, to name the ache, to feel the emptiness, without rushing to fill it. Because when you finally allow grief, you stop begging the past to return, and you begin, quietly, to come back to yourself. 13. Choosing emotional truth. Emotional truth doesn't arrive like a breakthrough. It arrives like a quiet refusal. A refusal to keep lying to yourself. Not dramatic, not loud, just steady. It's the moment you stop saying, "It's not that bad," when it is. The moment you stop editing your reality so someone else can stay comfortable. Because after the grief settles, after you let yourself feel what you lost, something inside you becomes very clear. You can no longer unknow what you know. You know how it feels to shrink your needs. You know how it feels to hold back words that want to be spoken. You know how it feels to sit next to someone you love and feel unseen. And once you know that, you can't keep calling it love without betraying yourself. Choosing emotional truth doesn't mean confrontation. It doesn't mean ultimatums. Sometimes it means honesty without an audience. It means saying, inside your own chest, "This hurts. This isn't enough for me. I want more than this." Not more attention, not more words, more presence, more safety, more being met. And that truth feels terrifying, because it removes your excuses. You can't blame timing anymore. You can't blame stress. You can't blame circumstances. You have to face the simple, painful clarity. This relationship is asking you to abandon yourself, to keep it alive. And Evelyn felt that truth, like a line drawn in her body. On one side, the version of her who keeps adapting, who keeps hoping, who keeps waiting. On the other, the version of her who stays whole. Choosing emotional truth means choosing the second one, even if it's lonely, even if it's uncertain, even if it scares you. Because lying to yourself costs more than any honest loss ever could. And once you choose truth, something shifts. You stop negotiating with your intuition. You stop explaining away your pain. You stop asking, "Am I allowed to feel this?" You already know the answer. Yes. You are allowed to want depth. You are allowed to want consistency. You are allowed to want a love that doesn't require self-erasure. Emotional truth doesn't promise you an ending. It doesn't promise you a decision, yet. But it gives you something far more important. Alignment. The feeling that your inner world and your outer life are no longer at war. And once you taste that alignment, you realize going back to silence would be the real betrayal. 14. Presence as a requirement. At some point, you stop calling it needing too much, and you start calling it a requirement. Because presence isn't a luxury. It's not a nice bonus if someone has time. Presence is the foundation. Without it, love becomes paperwork, schedules, shared rent, polite affection, a relationship that looks fine from the outside and feels empty on the inside. Evelyn used to tell herself, "He shows up in other ways. He pays bills. He drives when it rains. He remembers birthdays. And those things matter." They do. But she finally understood something simple. None of it replaces being emotionally held. Because you can't build intimacy on transactions. You can't heal in a home where your feelings are treated like interruptions. You can't feel safe with someone who disappears the moment you get real. So she began to shift the standard. Not, "Do you love me?" but, "Can you be with me? Can you stay present when I'm messy, when I'm tired, when I'm not performing happiness? Can you listen without fixing? Can you hold space without rushing away?" Because presence is what turns love into shelter. Presence is what makes a relationship a place you can exhale. And once you taste even a little of that, you realize how starved you've been. You realize you've been surviving on crumbs. A good mood once a week. A warm hug when it's convenient. A conversation that ends the second it starts to matter. And you stop accepting it as normal. You stop calling yourself needy for wanting basic connection. You stop apologizing for wanting your partner to notice you. Because wanting presence is not asking for perfection. It's asking for participation. It's asking to be treated like a person, not a task. Evelyn didn't need grand gestures. She didn't need endless romance. She needed something smaller and rarer. A man who could stay in the room when her eyes filled with tears. A man who didn't make her feel guilty for being human. A man who could say, "I'm here," and actually mean it. That's when she realized presence isn't a preference. It's the minimum. Not because she's demanding, but because she finally stopped negotiating her own emotional safety. And when presence becomes your requirement, everything else becomes clearer. You start seeing who can meet you and who can only love you from a distance. 15. The quiet release. Letting go doesn't always look like a door closing. Sometimes it looks like a breath you finally stop holding. It's quiet. So quiet that people around you won't even notice. Because the release isn't dramatic. It's internal. It's the moment you stop trying to prove your lovability to someone who can't receive love the way you give it. It's the moment you stop translating neglect into, "He's just tired." It's the moment you stop waiting for the version of him you miss to come back. Evelyn didn't rage. She didn't threaten. She didn't beg. She simply shifted. She stopped reaching first. Stopped over-explaining. Stopped offering softness to someone who kept meeting her with distance. Not to punish him, but to protect herself. Because she finally understood. If someone is consistently unavailable, your chasing won't make them present. Your kindness won't cure their avoidance. Your patience won't grow their capacity. All it will do is teach your heart to keep accepting hunger as normal. So the quiet release began with small decisions. Not texting when she felt lonely. Not forcing conversation when the room went cold. Not performing cheerfulness to keep him comfortable. She began returning her energy to the place it belonged. Back into her own body. Back into her own life. She started taking walks without explaining. Sitting in cafes with a book. Calling friends she'd been too tired to answer. And every time she chose herself, a little grief lifted. Because she wasn't abandoning him. She was stopping the abandonment of herself. That is what release really is. Not the absence of love, but the end of self-betrayal. It's the moment you stop asking, "Why won't you choose me?" and start saying, "I choose me." Quietly. Without applause. Without revenge. Just a clean truth. And the strange part is, the world doesn't collapse when you do this. You still wake up. The sun still rises. Your life continues. But inside, something returns. Your nervous system unclenches. Your breath becomes deeper. Your thoughts stop circling the same questions. And you begin to feel something you forgot existed. Space. Space to be honest. Space to feel. Space to heal. The quiet release is not a breakup. Not yet. It's a loosening. A soft goodbye to the hope that kept hurting you. A gentle surrender of the fantasy of being met by someone who never learned how. And in that surrender, Evelyn didn't become cold. She became free. 16. She wasn't broken. She wasn't broken. That was the truth Evelyn had to learn slowly. Not in one brave moment, but in 100 quiet ones. Because for so long, she thought the ache in her chest meant something was wrong with her. That if she felt lonely beside someone, it was because she was too sensitive, too intense, too needy. But what she was grieving. Grieving the version of love that felt warm. Grieving the version of herself that didn't have to shrink to be kept. And when she finally stopped treating her feelings like a flaw, the healing began to look different. Not like moving on overnight. Not like instant confidence. But like softness returning. She started sleeping deeper. Laughing without checking the room first. Speaking without rehearsing every sentence. She started noticing how much of her life had been spent trying to earn presence. As if attention was a reward. And connection was something she had to deserve. And then she understood something simple and holy. Love isn't proven by how long you tolerate emptiness. Love is proven by how safe you feel inside it. So she stopped measuring herself by someone else's capacity. She stopped calling her needs too much and started calling them human. Because the truth is, if you have to disappear to keep a relationship peaceful, it isn't peace. It's silence. And silence is not love. Evelyn didn't become cold. She didn't become bitter. She became honest. She began to live from the inside out. Instead of from fear. She learned that emotional strength isn't pretending you don't hurt. It's letting yourself feel the hurt without turning it into shame. And if this story sounds familiar, if you've ever loved someone who was there, but not with you, please hear this. Softly, clearly. You are not broken. You are not too much. You are not difficult for wanting warmth. You are a person who deserves presence. And whatever you choose next Whether you stay, whether you leave, whether you're still unsure, your feelings are valid. Your grief makes sense. Because you can miss someone, even while they're still in the room. And you can heal, even before anything changes on the outside. If this episode reached you, do me a small favor? Like this video, so it can find the people who are quietly carrying the same pain. Share it with someone who needs permission to stop blaming themselves. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever felt alone while still together? What did that silence teach you? And if you want more stories like this, stories that hold the feelings most people don't know how to name, subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast. We'll be here, softly, honestly, every time you need somewhere to breathe.